right now. Powerful words from the president. I'm sure it's going to startle all the folks where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I've not heard, obviously, none of us have heard the US president talk about it in such stark terms as that. He was even pressed by one of the reporters there in the briefing room. How do you know he's made that decision? He said, because we've got considerable intelligence capability, revealing there that they, or saying at least, that they have got an insight into what Vladimir Putin intends to do. And look, it's such a massive departure, Wolf, from the situation we were in, just a few minutes ago, or just 6 months ago, or just last week. We've been talking for that whole period about the build-up of tens of thousands of troops by Russia near the borders of Ukraine. We've been talking about how Russia poses a real threat, or gives the impression of posing a threat. But right up until the 11th hour, the 59th minute of the 11th hour, as we keep on saying, Vladimir Putin can decide whether or not to pull the trigger on an invasion. What the President of the United States is now saying is that he believes that decision at the Kremlin to invade Ukraine has actually been taken by Vladimir Putin. I've already reached out to my contacts at the Kremlin to see what reaction they've got. They haven't got back to me yet, but when they do, I'm going to bring it right to you. And
it's still on. President Zelensky of Ukraine going to leave the country, head off to this Munich security conference, even though U.S. officials are deeply concerned the Russians will take advantage of that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe after hearing those remarks by President Biden, he'll think again about his travel plans. But I spoke to Ukrainian officials just a few minutes ago about those travel plans and about those concerns that have been raised by the White House, that if President Zelensky leaves the country, there could be a conflict starting and flights would stop and he wouldn't be able to get back again, or it could be perceived as a sort of, a sense in which, the president of the country has left the country ahead of an invasion. The president of Ukraine has left the country ahead of an invasion. And what the Ukrainian officials I spoke to said is, look, diplomacy at the moment is just as important as the front line in eastern Ukraine. And it's inconceivable, I'm slightly paraphrasing them here, but it's inconceivable, they say, that government representatives, that the president of the country wouldn't engage in that kind of diplomacy at the highest level. And that's what they see this Munich security conference as, particularly as because there's a meeting scheduled with the US Vice President and President Zelensky.
Stand by. I want to bring Jim Sciutto into this analysis of what's going on. He's also in the Ukrainian capital for us. Jim, you've been reporting all day, and you've been ahead of the curve on this, that there has been in recent days a palpable change among U.S. and NATO officials, and we heard that directly from the president moments ago.
The palpable change being that they have a bleak assessment of Russian intentions here, and you heard that very directly, very publicly from the president there. I think we need to reiterate to hear that from the U.S. president saying the decision has been made, because to this point, the position had been they have the capabilities, they have all the forces they need to launch a comprehensive invasion of Ukraine, but that Putin had not yet made that decision. So the U.S. president says, in fact, the latest assessment is that he has made that decision. The other notable comment, I think, was the president saying that attacking here in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, is part of the plan. Now, I've been reporting for some time that at the higher end of Russian options here, of Putin's options here, was a broad-scale invasion from the south, the east, including down here in the capital, Ukraine, but that considered not an outlier, but the most dramatic decision that the Russian president could make here. The U.S. president just said he believes Kyiv is a target of that invasion plan. That's a remarkable thing to say. That this is a capital, a free capital of a sovereign European state in the year 2022, and the U.S. believes Russia not only has the forces to take over this capital, but now the Russian president has made the decision to do so as well. That's quite a moment in these weeks, frankly, a build-up to the threat to Ukraine.
And let's not forget where you are, the city of Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital. It's a city of almost 3 million people right now, yeah. And we just heard President Biden say that city is about to be attacked by the Russians. Abby Phillip, give us a sense of how critical a moment this is right now for President Biden, indeed for the world.
I think President Biden was basically preparing the American public, as he and his administration have for several weeks now, for a really significant event for the United States and for Europe. If Russia were to invade Ukraine in the way that Jim just described, that could mean some of the most significant fighting in Europe since the end of World War II. that's nothing to take lightly, and you see the significance of it in the way that the president's aides have been trying to say to the American people that while we are not going to put our soldiers on the line, this matters to us. And a corollary to that is this could have effects on us as a country in terms of how gas prices are affected and in terms of our broader security. So the president is in a very pivotal moment for his presidency. He just came off of the experience in Afghanistan that was embarrassing for his administration. This is his moment to show leadership on the global stage and to restore a sense of competency from the American public that he is and his administration are capable of managing a really thorny and tricky situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, this is a very, very dangerous moment indeed, not just for Europe, but indeed for the world. Everybody stand by. I want to bring in retired U.S. General Philip Breedlove, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. General Breedlove, give me your immediate reaction to those ominous words we just heard from the President of the United States.
Thanks, Wolf. Well, for sure, we have seen for a number of days that Mr. Putin had a force that was ready and capable, not being exposed to everything the president is exposed to. It's clear now that he believes this is going to happen. And I think that is a tough judgment to have to deal with. Apparently, Mr. Putin has looked at what he sees the West is prepared to do, and he's decided that it is worth it for him to make this adventure.
But you heard the president also say he will pay, Putin and the Russian people will pay a very, very steep price. Not only sanctions from the U.S., the NATO allies, the European Union, so many other countries around the world, but an enormous political price. Russia will be isolated. And also in terms of casualties, if there's a full-scale war, a lot of Russian troops are going to be killed. Is Putin ready for that?
Well, if he invades, then he's made the decision that he's ready for it. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. You are right, though. There are things that are not in his favor. Remember, it was the moms in Moscow that gave him so much trouble after the last invasion of Ukraine, and his own problems at home with young soldiers coming home in body bags. And so he's got to have this in his calculus. I think, though, that when it comes to sanctions, what he has seen in the past is that he can weather them. People often ask, has it changed or affected Mr. Putin? And clearly our sanctions have affected Russia. But what is also not clear is that it has not changed his behavior. Because after 2008, we sanctioned him. After 2014, we sanctioned him. And now he's right back on the border of Ukraine. So I think this time the West has to really deliver so that he doesn't come back again in 2 or 3 years.
Let me go to Moscow right now. Nick Robertson is on the scene for us. Do they appreciate the enormity of what is about to happen? The President of the United States saying in the next few days, this week, Russia is about to invade Ukraine, and there's going to be enormous fallout. Do folks in Moscow, where you are, Nick, appreciate that?
I don't think that they fully appreciate what might happen. I think that they think that there's a resilience in Russia at the moment. And I think part of Putin's calculation may also be that even when he had the problem with the Moscow mums and the body bags coming back from his invasion of Ukraine back in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, his own popularity rating went through the roof. It was up in the 90s. It's in the 60s now. I think to getting to what President Biden had said there, about this, more and more disinformation and the fabrication of a case and cause to go to war. That is absolutely what Russian viewers have been seeing on their TVs this afternoon, as those two rebel leaders from Donetsk and Luhansk in the east of Ukraine called on the civilians in those areas to get on buses and drive to take shelter inside Russia. The images that were being played on state television here, and I have to tell you, quite incredible, because on the main screen that was playing It was it was redecorating your house. Yet in a little box on the screen were young children getting ready to be loaded onto buses, old people packing bags to evacuate on a permanent loop. So it really was ginning up that idea that people are under threat, that the vulnerable are under threat, that Russia needs to help them. And just to get to President Biden's point that he appears to have made the calculation that Putin is going for the invasion, Biden was asked that question, is there still space for diplomacy? And he said, I'm not sure that he wants diplomacy. And I think gets to that underlying thing that beside this military buildup all the time has been this potentially fabricated narrative for diplomacy. That again fits with what Biden's talking about with fabrications, Wolf.
You know, Jim Sciutto,
Disturbed by the largest
go ahead,
land
Jim.
war since World War II, if these predictions bear out. That's a remarkable, it's a sobering moment to witness. I think we have to be conscious of the many costs involved on all sides if this goes forward. It is quite a moment to be in, quite a sobering moment to be in.